Now, this is where I would like to go back to the origins. So, what do Chinese companies do abroad, and specifically, what do Chinese state-owned companies do abroad? These state-owned companies, the kind of companies we are going to talk about, like Sinopec, like Bank of China. I don't want to take airlines as an example because their history doesn't go back long enough. But these companies, energy companies, oil companies, utility companies, banks, construction companies, healthcare companies, they were created in China as ministry bureaus to provide domestic services. So if you look at their charters, if you look at their history, just the very fact that they have international activities, not all of them do, by the way, but those who do have international activities, it can sound a little bit strange because they were not created to compete in a capitalist market, and they were definitely not created to compete in a capitalist market abroad. So what are they doing abroad in the first place? Why is this an important question? Because that also scrutinizes the objective, the vision of programs like, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is one of the big vehicles for Chinese companies to go abroad, and which are run on state resources to conduct certain activities abroad, some of which are market-based, but some of them are not really market-based. So we can ask the question, what is happening here? Why is this happening in the first place? And then one of the stuff that comes up very often, one of the narratives that is supposed to explain to us is the following. China was the leading economy in the world for a very long time. And what is happening right now is after a century of dormancy, a century of international inactivity, which you can blame on different factors, but let's look at this a little bit later. China is basically reclaiming its previous position as the largest, richest, most influential economy in the world. Have you ever heard this before? Some of you have. Now, this narrative often comes together with visuals like this. So if you look at this, this was, once I posted it after one of these lectures, and that was my most visited LinkedIn updates ever. So normally I get a couple of thousand views on something I post on LinkedIn. This one got something like 200,000 views. So it's a very popular narrative. What it says is that if you take away the ancient empires, that this is 2,000 years, right? And this is the share of GDP calculated into current dollars. Share of GDP, very important. So the share of world GDP against time. So this is the beginning of the 2,000-year history, that AD, and then it goes up. And as you can see, if we take away the ancient empires that are not already there, then the leading continuous economy is China. And I can send you these PDFs, by the way. The last page, my last slide is going to be my contact method, so that's all you need to know, and I'm very happy to send you these visuals. Okay. Whenever you see something like this, so I think usually you can tell that this is too simple. There are two things about it that I want to explain. One of them is that this is the share of GDP, and this needs qualification. And then the second one is this part is actually very generous. If we look at 1950s, 60s, 70s, this one goes down to almost zero. So this is where China started from at the beginning of what is known as the Reform and Opening period, Deng Xiaoping. You probably heard about this time. So I want to quickly show you a couple of slides, and then you can ask me questions about it if you want, because I don't know how deep your interest goes into this topic. But I saw this, I said, all right, this looks great, but let's look at it a little bit in a more nuanced way, so to speak. So first of all, the share of GDP, but what does this really mean? A share of GDP means that however much value was created in the world, this is percentage-wise, this is as much China created from it. But if we look at the same data in a different way, so this is again GDP, this is not share of GDP, this is GDP in the world, from 1 to 2018, and the green part is China. So if you look at GDP in the world in the last 2,000 years, actually you could say most of the value in the world was created by China. And these are all the other economies I chose to compare it to. And if you look at this, you can see here Industrial Revolution. That's when, first of all, it becomes more nuanced. So Western Europe, Turkey, all the big empires come in. And secondly, that's when China's share and absolute output is becoming a little bit less. So far, so good? Yes. But, very importantly, as we will see, this is the world GDP from 1 to 2018. And this is extremely important because that means that according to today's standards, this is all calculated to today's US dollars. Actually, during most of history, people didn't create almost anything. So if you compare your lifestyle to the lifestyle of hundreds and hundreds of years of human history, people were poor most of the time. And that's very important. So look at this. This is the picture in 1900, right? And Western Europe, which is the biggest economy altogether, if we translate it into today's US dollars, altogether the output was $1.1 trillion. So if you have a basic understanding of economics, right now the United States, this kind of stimulation package that they introduced is more money than this. And that was the richest economy. If you go down at that time, China, 388 billion. In today's money, it's not an awful lot of money, right? I can see your body language. So basically, and this is 1900. This is not 1500. So just remember that graph that I showed you before. That was the share, China's share in the world economy. So it was a big share, but in a very small economy. And that is quite important because if you read people like Marco Polo, or if you look at the people who post those graphs on LinkedIn or on Twitter or on YouTube or wherever else, you imagine that China was amazingly rich most of the time. But that's not true for many, many reasons. First of all, because nobody was very rich, according to current standards. And secondly, because if you look at GDP per person, then again, it's a completely different picture. Two important things. Number one, again, until modern times, if you look at GDP per capita, again, everybody was poor. China was mildly richer, and India and these ancient empires, but by and large, everybody was pretty poor. And then GDP per capita started climbing up, but then China was relatively poor in comparison. You see, slightly lower than the world average. Here is the world average. And Greece, Spain, Italy, United States, and so on. And this is important for us. Why? Because we are trying to understand what is it that China is trying to reestablish here. So if the narrative is that China is just reclaiming its position as the richest, most affluent empire or country in the world, there was no such time. Relatively speaking, China had more resources, but in modern terms, nobody had those kind of resources. And we will see one of the reasons is because economies were not connected with each other. And the second thing is that actually, if you look at value versus value per capita, a very important lesson is that even though at times China was very rich, but its number one way of creating value was mostly cheap labor. So all of these people who, if you look at it person by person, they were very far from being rich, even in comparison to people in all of these other economies. Now, number one, cheap labor can give China a huge advantage. But cheap labor also creates a lot of unhappiness on the larger scale, because people don't want to be cheap labor. It's great for the country, it's not great for the individual. And it has always been like this in China. So there are times in Chinese history, and I think our time is one of these times, when cheap labor actually becomes the export commodity. And this is one of the reasons why state-owned companies are going abroad. This is one of the reasons why the Belt and Road Initiative is so important. And this is not the first time in the history of the Chinese empire. Actually, there have been several times, I don't know how interested you are in history, but we can look at it if you want to, when basically China was exporting workers by the hundreds of thousands, because if you look at price for value analysis, that's where China could create the most value abroad. So this is why I find it so important to look at these graphs. So far, so good? Okay. So this is the same thing. Do you know why I picked 1842?
Because Shanghai was, due to the Nanking Treaty, Shanghai was open to foreigners.
Exactly. Nanking Treaty, the end of the First Opium War, and officially the beginning of the 100 years of humiliation in Chinese historical law. You probably heard about this. So the 100 years was a little bit more than 100 years, right? Because 42 to 1949. But this is the official start of China's problems with the rest of the world. Let's put it this way. So if you look at this, China was much more isolated from the rest of the world, was interacting with the rest of the world much more on its own terms. And then at this time, China was not interacting with the rest of the world on its own terms. But still, if you look at it, and this is again GDP per capita, you can see that China was slightly lower than the world average. But we are talking about modern times, so nobody is debating this, that in the last 150 years, China was a relatively poor country. If you went back, I mean, if you want to do this, if you like graphs, you can go to Our World in Data, and you could look at any 100 years. So you could even, no, I already cut out this, but you can slide back and forth, and if you want, you can look at 1600 to 1700. Very detailed analysis. So these are the last little bit more than 100 years, and this is what we are going to talk about in terms of China closing down, opening up, closing down, opening up, and this is generally what characterizes the history of China's interaction with the rest of the world. Now, the narrative from the Chinese government, which is important because that's the narrative for Chinese state-owned companies, this is definitely not what China wants to recreate. But very often what we think is this is what China wants to recreate. What happened before this 100-something year period. But we will look at it very carefully because we will ask the question, when Chinese private and state-owned companies go abroad, through programs like Belt and Road, do we really want to recreate that situation that characterized the time before 1842? So we are going to look at it in detail. And then I will stop for a moment, but this is where we are right now. So Chinese overseas M&As, this is 2020, so it's relatively recent figures. As you can see deal value in US billions. So as you can see, it is a fairly big, mainly in Asia, Europe, North America, and so on. So this is mergers and acquisitions. This is just one of the ways for China to go abroad out of the 4 or 5 different ways that I would like to look at with you today. But it's definitely not the picture of a beginner state. So it's not what we would have seen 25 years ago. And then here, top 10 destinations of mergers and acquisitions, which basically means either China buying a foreign company like KUKA, the robot-making company, or China creating a merger with another company for certain purposes. I will stop here and ask you if you have questions.